Certainly.
Thank you.
Our first speaker this evening is Shiva Nourpanah. Shiva is the Provincial Coordinator at Transition House Association and a postdoctorate fellow at the Center for the Study of Social and Legal Responses to Violence. It is my pleasure to welcome Shiva. Please go ahead, Shiva.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for inviting me and giving me this time and opportunity to talk about the organization for which I work and talk about gender-based violence more broadly and the resources that are available for provincially and also nationally for people who are somehow involved or concerned with this particular form of this particular crime. Can I ask you to, will you be scroll? There we are. So in this presentation, I'll briefly talk about who we are and what we do, what is STANS, what is the Transition House Association of Nova Scotia. I'll point you to where there are the resources that I mentioned earlier, where people can, go online if they're able, or if they're able to make a phone call and, find where to access a variety of resources. And it's interesting because definitely part of the learning experience is how complex gender-based violence is and how much it touches upon other aspects of life, mental health, housing, immigration status, citizenship status. All those are intertwined or, touch on gender-based violence, and accordingly, there are all sorts of different resources which can be accessed, which may at first glance look as though there isn't much related, but in fact there is. I also want to talk very briefly about the history of STANS, and I think it's important in terms of understanding how far we've come, not as an organization, not in terms of my own organization, but also as a society in recognizing gender-based violence as a crime, as a public issue, which needs to be addressed publicly. Certainly that's something that the pandemic has really brought to light. So I think it's very important also to, bear that kind of historic context in mind. So with that said, can we please move on to the other? Thank you. But first of all, we just want to cover briefly what is gender-based violence. And there you'll see, referring back to the complexity of this issue, there's different terminologies, there's different ways to describe this particular issue, this particular form of violence, and that kind of reflects the different context with which it may take place. So, and part of the reason why we have all these different terminology is that it can happen in the family arena. We typically think of gender-based violence or domestic violence as being hard to deal with because it is it takes place in the private household. It takes place in the context of intimate relations. So it's something that's very hard for people to talk about, to articulate their feelings around, to articulate what happens. And it has really serious repercussions legally if there are children involved, if there's property involved, right? So, but it's not always. So gender-based violence, and then, so you can, that's certainly one way and one context for gender-based violence, this private, familial, intimate place. But then also we have things which are dealt, which, our organizations deal with, which they witness, such as sex trafficking and human trafficking, where it's still gender-based violence, but it's in a different context altogether, such as date rape or, sexual assault in our organizations witness and offer support to a fair number of. So there's always this angle of intimacy involved with gender-based violence, but not always. As I say, it could be like as a result of date rape, as a result of intimate, as a result of sexual assault by a stranger, although we know that that's not as common as we might think. And there's this kind of private public issue around gender-based violence, which makes it particularly hard to address. Some other things a couple of other issues that we want to that I want to bring to forefront, and as you can see, these are two kind of standard definitions of gender-based violence that I've pulled off. One is from a kind of international level by UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, which presents gender-based violence as a human rights issue, which it absolutely is. The other one is from in the Canadian context by the Federal Status of Women, where which draws our attention to how gender-based violence is interwoven in our daily lives, right? In the jokes that our kids make, in their video games, in the schoolyard, we can see the roots of gender-based violence taking place, and the kind of demeaning language and discourse that is unfortunately continues to remain prevalent in parts of society. It's still there. What I particularly like about the UNHCR definition is that it also it also highlights that gender-based violence is often rooted in a power in an inequality or an imbalance of power, where one party, for whether rightly or wrongly, feels that they are in a position of power over the other party, and thus feels that they can get away with various forms of abuse. So yeah, and another point that needs to be made as we think about the definition of gender-based violence is, of course, physical violence is a crime. It's against the law. But physical violence isn't the only form of gender-based violence. The definition by Status of Women offers, the kind of linguistic, verbal forms of abuse and harassment in violence against women organizations. It's fairly common to talk about emotional abuse, psychological abuse, financial abuse, abuse of beliefs, and religious abuse. So there are different class of forms of abuse and violence which aren't always manifested physically, although again these can be quite interconnected and intertwined. And while as I mentioned, physical abuse is a crime, there are efforts and there is some advocacy taking place, and it has taken place in other countries to make various forms of psychological abuse, what's known as coercive control and so on, to criminalize that also. And that's an interesting area for discussion, and it's still up for debate. So again, just to reiterate, this is a very complicated arena. It involves the deepest parts of our psyche and our emotions, and sometimes it's very hard to discuss these things in a kind of less emotional way, rightly so, just given the nature of what it is we're talking about. So I pulled out some facts and figures just so we have an idea. So gender-based violence, like many other things, is very hard to quantify, partly because of the nature that I described with the before, that it does take place in a private arena, that it does have so many that it can have so many serious repercussions and consequences, which perhaps the perpetrator or the victim never even thought of or never even wanted in the first place. It's a pretty, as far as I can tell from looking at various studies, it's pretty much acknowledged that something between 1/5 to 1/8 or 10th of the actual of physical abuse is police reported. Again, studies varies and there's different methods of counting. What is very much widely acknowledged is that women are far more likely than men to experience intimate partner violence, And the nature of the services, which has, grown to respond to this, reflects the fact that women are by and large most likely to be the victims of this. Women also account by and large for the vast majority of intimate partner homicides, which is of course the most extreme case, you could argue, of intimate partner violence. And women, again, are also more likely to be sexually assaulted. A disturbing statistic for Nova Scotia particularly that I was able to dig out was that in Nova Scotia particularly, the rate of police reported domestic violence has increased. And again, please note the distinction between police reported and non-police reported. It is, our common understanding that the police reported incidents are so-called the tip of the iceberg, and by far the vast majority of incidents of domestic violence don't go reported, and in fact victims try not to report it for a variety of reasons, which we may get to discussing or not. So these are just, again, some statistics and pointing you to directions in case you are interested in having a deeper look at those. So who are we and what do we do? So I am Fans. I'm a 1 woman and a half. I'm full-time and a half-time and a part-time colleague. We're based in Halifax, Nova Scotia. We are the Transition House Association of Nova Scotia, and we're an umbrella association of violence against women organizations across the province. So our member organizations are largely based in rural and small town Halifax. Rural and small town Nova Scotia. In Halifax, there's Bryony House, which is the main, and Avalon Sexual Assault Center. They're not members of Transition House Association of Nova Scotia. However, we do work closely together. We share clients. One thing that we all learned was that people are quite mobile. Women are mobile. They tend to move from place to place, and so there's a lot of connection and interrelationship between our various organizations. Our member organizations, I've listed them all here. They spread from Amherst, Sydney, Kentville, Bridgewater, Yarmouth, Port Hawkesbury. I want to make special mention of the Millbrook Family Healing Center, which actually, I should say the Mi'kmaq Family Healing Center, which runs 2 women's shelters in Millbrook, Truro, and Wakaba, Cape Breton. And they offer culturally appropriate, culturally sensitive supports to Indigenous women. And I have to underscore, although they're called Mi'kmaq Family Healing Center, they offer services to all Indigenous women, not just Mi'kmaq women. And yeah, so these are our member organizations. Another point that I'd like to make is all these organizations, except Naomi Society in Antigonish, they all offer what I've written here, communal shelter and 24/7 hour open available shelter and residence to women and children who need immediate shelter and can't stay in their home. Naomi Society is what we call an outreach office. So the kind of new or a different way of thinking around services for victimized women and children is to meet them where they're at, where there are all sorts of reasons why women and children don't want to go to a communal shelter. And of course, in many cases, they're escorted there by police or by child protection. Again, this is a very complicated issue. Oftentimes women aren't given a choice, or their choice is like child protection tells them, if you don't go to a shelter, we'll have to take your children away because home is not safe for them. So there's all sorts of ways in which women choose to go or end up in shelters. But we also do offer, or I should say our organizations across the province do offer outreach services, such as what is offered in Antigonish, where they meet, it's an office, like a 9-to-5 office, which offers counseling services, and they support women by referring them to and developing safety plans for them, and if necessary, referring them and arranging transport for them to be physically relocated into a shelter. So yeah, can we So I'm gonna be sending the address, the web address for these resources to Anne, who will presumably disseminate them to you. But this is a resource center developed by the Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the Status of Women, which is also linked to our website, which receives funding, I should have added, by the Nova Scotia Advisory, by the province, by the Nova Scotia Advisory Council on the Status of Women. And here you will see, there's a variety of different ways of how to access support. I should have mentioned when I was talking about different types of abuse, physical abuse, emotional, and so on, digital abuse, cyber or digital violence. And of course, with the pandemic, that has become like a huge topic, as so much of our social activity has moved online. So, different ways that you can stay safe online, and, the different kinds of research and statistics, and also where to find help, where to access help, and, who to talk with if you need to talk to somebody. So again, this will be disseminated to you. So this is a picture of Yarmouth in the 1970s, and I did want to touch briefly about the history of fans, but also about the history of shelter movements in general and women's rights movement in general. So I don't know if maybe during the pandemic you had an opportunity to look back at old TV shows from the 90s, and by old I mean from the 90s, so not even that old. Certainly I do from time to time. I like to revisit the shows of my youth, and almost every time I'm actually appalled by every time there's a, what did they just say? Like, how did that was okay then? And I am talking about, say, shows that were made in the 1990s. I'm not even talking about the 50s or 60s, or whenever we think about as being and even just looking at it will immediately clue us in at how much progress has been made. And I think it's always important to acknowledge, because otherwise, especially in the line of work, we are just so easy to feel overwhelmed and super depressed and all that. So it's really important to acknowledge the progress that has been made, and that is all to a large extent thanks to community grassroots advocates and grassroots movements. So how fans evolved, how these organizations evolved, they were grassroots responses to observed needs in their communities. So they were, in other words, in plain language, they were a bunch of women who observed the various, actually heartbreaking stories. There were incidences of suicide in local communities, women taking, because they just couldn't stay at home and they didn't have a safe space to go to. And these shelters generally evolved from observed local need that women need a safe space. And they still do. So I said we've made a lot of progress, but in another sense, we haven't made a lot of progress, because women and children still need a safe space to go to. So we do have these safe spaces, so that's good, but we really want to work towards a time where we don't need them anymore. It's sad that we still need them. And I can, tell you of my own experience taking on this job. I'm an immigrant from Iran. I remember I'd be telling my family in Iran what I'd be doing, and they literally couldn't believe it. They were like, but Canada, Canada is such a beacon of equality, development, progress across the world. And they simply could not believe that this kind of job was necessary. And I was like, no, that's what I'm doing. There's these houses everywhere across Canada. And they were like, what? Why? Aren't women completely why? What are you talking about? So there's been a lot of progress, as I say, but there's still ways to go, right? So the shelter movement has definitely progressed. It's evolved from that kind of grassroots knee-jerk response to these observed situations of distress where local communities would just decide to dedicate a house to, providing refuge to women. The shelter movement is considered a political advocacy force for more than just shelter now. The most recent publication by Women's Shelter Canada was called More Than a Bed, which encapsulates all the different services and advocacy efforts and accompaniments and all that is conducted at our organization. So we've definitely come a long way from when those first shelters were set up in the 1970s by a local group, but there's still ways to go. That's kind of where I want to kind of come to a finishing point. I said that I'd be pointing you to a specific resource. If you're concerned about someone, this is the number to call or text. It's 24/7. There's going to be a trained counselor on the line to, just talk over the situation with you. It's toll-free, confidential. They'll point you to the right resources, and hopefully you'll be able to access help. But definitely it is a tricky situation, and it's very much appreciated when people do reach out to ask how to help somebody, because one of the things we hear again and again is, a certain amount of victim blaming. Why doesn't she leave? Why can't she leave this situation? Again, especially like in Canada, why can't she leave? That's something that I hear. There's all sorts of barriers. There's all sorts of studies in why victimized women can't leave. One study says that women are, on average, might be victimized up to 17 times or more before they actually decide to leave, if they ever do. So it's definitely not as easy as saying, well, she should just up and leave. So yeah, it's a very nuanced, complicated area. Like, just think how difficult sometimes relationships can be in general when there isn't any violence involved. Now think about relationships but with violence. So yeah, it's not easy. With that said, I think I'm out of time, and yeah, there's lots to talk about, so keep your questions coming, and thank you again for listening and showing up and listening to me. Thank you.